Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vaga Muradian here at the Heritage Foundation think tank in Washington, D.C., where we heard an absolutely fascinating presentation from the former U.S. Strategic Commander, General Kevin Chilton, Chilton, 3 times in space as an astronaut, and the only astronaut to have achieved 4-star rank in any of the military services, test pilot, and also once you went to Strategic Command after your space career, became very well versed in nuclear strategic thinking. Thanks very much for fascinating comments and for the time.
Well, great. It's great to see you again. Great to be back together. You were just reminiscing how it's been over a decade, close to 2, since we saw each other last.
Well, and that was the first time we interviewed, but I did bother you a couple of times when you were at, that's right, at Space Command and elsewhere. But I want to start with, there was so much thought-provoking, and we're going to be posting the video on our website so that people can see the full power of your comments, including the way you concluded it about why a world with nuclear weapons is actually a better world than the awful world that we saw, and I want you to talk about that if you get a moment. But more specifically, the administration is working on a new nuclear posture review. The last administration, President Obama was passionate about a nuclear-free world, but recognized it was important to make an investment, and the investment number was so big that it terrified everybody at more than $1 trillion. But this administration has an opportunity to chart a new course. We're looking at a Russia that looks at nuclear weapons as a de-escalatory tool and fielding a vast array of tactical nuclear weapons that aren't covered by any of the strategic agreements we have with them. The Chinese are looking at a vast assortment of weapons. Even our European allies, the Brits and the French, are developing new generations of weapons. And as you artfully noted, the newest one we have is the W-88, which means it was designed and went into production in 1988. So talk to us a little bit, if you were the one writing the nuclear posture review, what are some of the core elements about what the U.S. nuclear arsenal needs to look like to prepare future presidents for a much more dangerous world?
Well, Vago, I think you'd first start with, you have to recognize that the environment that we're operating in today has changed from the Cold War. I mean, oftentimes when you get in discussions about this, people immediately go to, well, that's just Cold War think, the nuclear deterrence. It's not Cold War think. It's current day think. And, we took about a 15-year holiday from thinking about it. And in that 15-year period, the world changed. Pakistan and India went nuclear. North Korea now has gone nuclear. Iran threatened to go nuclear. The Russians have changed their declaratory policy. China has gone from a limited nuclear deterrent to a growing nuclear deterrent that threatens not only the United States but our regional allies and our regionally deployed forces. And so you first have to have an honest discussion about what the environment is like that we're in. And you use that as a rationale to base a discussion on what it is that you need to go forward. One thing that's almost independent of the changing environment that I would add that I think is really important is, the W-88, as you mentioned, was designed in 1988. So the scientists, the engineers, the technicians, the manufacturing folks that worked on that, the last test of a nuclear weapon in '92 by the U.S., they're all about to retire. And based on policy, self-constraint that we've imposed on ourselves, no one else in the world has imposed on themselves. We've stopped allowing our scientists and our engineers and our technicians to design and build a new nuclear weapon capability. Even if we said we're not going to field it, they can't even begin to talk about it. And we get zero funded in the Department of Energy for it. The human capital element has to be addressed now and quickly, in my view, to make sure that 10, 20, 40, 50 years, 100 years from now, because I believe the deterrent will still be required then, that we have citizens in this country that know how to not only maintain it, but to build new weapons. Because someday we will need new weapons. We cannot at life extend these forever. And we better know how to do it when we get there. And the only way to be assured of that is to exercise that muscle in the near term and raise another generation of scientists and engineers and technicians that have the know-how for going forward. So those are just a couple of things that I would emphasize going forward. I would also look to remove some of these constraints we have that are unilateral, that are imposed, no new weapons, for example, that nobody else in the world is abiding by. They were put in place under the premise that if we did that, the rest of the world would fall in line. So we've built no new weapons since the W-88. And in that time period, India's gone nuclear, Pakistan's gone nuclear, Syria was going to go nuclear, Iraq was going to go nuclear, both were interdicted by the Israelis. So there's no evidence, empirical evidence, that our restraint is having an effect because I think at the end of the day, all countries will do what's in their own best interest, regardless of what the United States does.
Right. But in a world, for example, where the Russians are doing what they're doing, what's the range in the array of weapons the United States needs on the tactical level in order to be able to counter that? Or are there other strategic ways to do that? Patrick Turner, who we spoke to last year at NATO, who was one of the authors of the British nuclear doctrine, made it clear that no nuclear weapon is tactical. It's all strategic, and that the Russians would be badly miscalculating if they ever thought they could do use a tactical weapon against NATO with impunity. But there are others who are not so sure that that would be the case. From your standpoint, do we need new weapons, reactivation of older weapons? What do we need what are the things that we need to do as a deterrent to the Russians who feel that they might be able to, who are spending a lot of time figuring out what's the right circumstance in which I might be able to use a capability like that as an intimidation tool?
Well, first of all, we have to recognize that there's been a change in the Russian declaratory policy. We know that, but we don't talk about it widely enough, and what the consequences of that change in their declaratory policy. And oh, by the way, although the Chinese have a stated no first use policy, you can drive a truck through the caveats in that. So essentially, they're not too far off from the Russians. And given that environment, the first question we have to ask is, how do we convince them to change that policy? And you can convince them, probably not likely through talks. It may take a comprehensive, but it could be as much as a change in our declaratory policy. My point is, I don't think there's a single silver bullet weapon out there or a single silver bullet answer to that question. I think it requires hard work and the development of a comprehensive strategy, which, if it cannot convince the Russians to change that declaratory policy and their feelings, it will deter them from ever thinking about crossing that threshold of first use in a conventional fight.
Let me take you to the question of the expense associated with nuclear weapons. At a time when we had these tactically fielded everywhere, it was an enormous cost, an enormous training cost, sustainment cost. It was a very important reason for it, but they were expensive. In a world where the defense budget is finite and we're now adding this element potentially to it, and the administration has signaled it would like to start production of new weapons, what would you trade off? You've been in the conventional world for a long time. You were a senior flag officer in the Air Force. You thought about these issues at a stratcom level, but also you were a conventional thinker. What are some of the trade-offs we have to make? What are some conventional systems we may want to gap to really be able to put some of these weapons in service? As you said at the very end of your presentation, in the Cold War, we were producing 3,000 weapons a year at the height of the Cold War. Just having 400 Alchems out there, the nuclear-armed cruise missiles, would change the calculus for any potential adversary.
Yeah. Well, first I'm going to push back a little bit on your assumption, your fundamental assumption that we have a fixed budget. And underlying, perhaps not you, but this argument that you hear from many is that even the triad, recapitalization of the triad and the weapons that are required and the command and control systems to include our satellites is unaffordable. I don't believe that for a minute. It's all a matter of priorities, in my view. I'm a firm believer that any dollar spent on conventional force structure in the United States military without an effective deterrent underpinning it is a wasted dollar. I'll give you an example. Let's say we gave the conventional forces in America today the Reagan buildup promised in the 1980s. 18 armored division, 40 combat wings of aircraft, 600 ship combat fleet Navy. Today we have less than 300 ships. Today we have less than 20 combat wings, and we don't have divisions anymore in the Army. But if I gave that all to the United States military today and took out sequester and gave them all the bombs and gas and fuel they needed to train so there was no morale or readiness issues that we have today, and had the most incredible conventional force on the planet, but I took away our nuclear deterrent and gave 30 nuclear missiles to President Maduro of Venezuela, who would be the power in the Western Hemisphere? It wouldn't be the United States of America. Who would hold all the cards at the negotiating table over? You picked the subject: trade, economics, diplomacy. That's the power of the deterrent. If you don't have it in today's world, where they're out there, if you don't have that underpinning your conventional force, you're wasting your money buying conventional things. So it's not a matter of affordability, it's a matter of prioritization. I wouldn't give up anything. I remember when this estimates first came out for the recapitalization of the triad, I believe it was $360 billion over 10 years. Nobody blinked. So the next estimate was $480 billion over 10 years. Nobody blinked. The next estimate was, 1 to 1.5 trillion over not only the development cycle but the lifetime of the weapons. $600 billion a year spread over a 10-year development and 30-year lifetime, 40 years, is less than 5% of the Defense Department budget. And I don't believe we're going to stay in sequester for the next 40 years. There will be growth beyond inflation because it's required. But even if there wasn't, at $600 billion, it's 5%. That's not unaffordable at all. It's discretionary.
And as you noted, right, the U.S. nuclear umbrella and the ability of the United States to reassure its allies is whether or not those allies believe that that reassurance is credible. It's not us telling them, it's by seeing what we can do, and also adversaries, right? What's your declaratory policy? Are you working those muscles? We're about to get the hook, and I have to ask you, you spent 11 years at NASA, 3 missions, you commanded the last one aboard Atlantis. John Young was one of the most legendary of astronauts, first man to be in space 6 times, the only one who test flew 2 first-of-type spacecraft. The first one, Gemini 3, with Gus Grissom as the commander. He did 2 Gemini missions, 2 Apollo missions, commanded Apollo 16, first space shuttle flight with Bob Crippen, and then one more mission for good measure before he retired, head of the astronaut office. What did he mean to you, and what is John Young's legacy as a spaceman?
Well, John was a friend, and I think...
and my condolences.
Well, thank you. And, but he was a friend of many people, because you would find no one more passionate about the manned spaceflight program in NASA than John Young. And in spite of all those incredible things that you just listed about him, he was incredibly humble. I would call him an unsung hero. I mean, people know who Neil Armstrong was, and rightfully so, and Alan Shepard, and rightfully so, and John Glenn, rightfully so, but I bet there's a lot of Americans that would read that John Young died and wouldn't know all the things that you just listed, all the firsts, his dedication, the sacrifices he made to stay in the program for his entire life, his entire career, beyond his Navy career, and dedicate himself to the safe development and operation of manned spacecraft, human spacecraft vehicles. If you're an astronaut in the astronaut office, how can you not love this man and want to be his friend? And I was blessed to be his friend. He was truly a great icon for the U.S. manned spaceflight program. He will be missed, and we'll mourn his loss, but we'll celebrate always the great achievements and his leadership in the world of safety.
And great sense of humor.
I think one of the driest wits I know. In fact, sometimes you'd walk away from a conversation, and then about 2 steps down the road, you'd go, "Okay, I get it." So he had a great wit, great sense of humor, and he was like a dog on a bone when it came to safety for human space flight, and I sure appreciated that. And I appreciated him.
And I'm glad NASA didn't get rid of him for that pastrami sandwich stunt on Gemini 3. Was it almost his first and last flight?
I just learned about that when he passed away. I hadn't heard that story, so it didn't linger on in the astronaut office, but as I read it, it just reminded me that the higher-ups and the Congress quite often don't have a sense of humor.
Sir, thanks very much. It's always a pleasure.
You bet. My pleasure. Good to be with you.